February 20, 2017, the news hits. Social Security is reducing the amount of money that it can pay its recipients by over 12%, and at the same time, they're increasing the amount that they take out of everybody's paycheck by over 12%. And why? Because they've realized that today, they are no longer able to meet the obligations that were the promises that were started back in the 1930s. They realized that that promise now has to be broken. That's today. What we have on that day is a world in which that giant social experiment, that experiment that said that someone else is going to care for my future, that American statement that says that we the people have a government that's going to make sure that we're taken care of, that statement has just been proven incorrect. Now, this is not the first time that's happened, but it is a very important and very different time that this has happened, because at the same time, at the exact same moment, February 20th, we also have nearly $19 trillion of debt. We also have an illiquid pension program. We also have an FDIC who's been insuring our bank deposits that is actually overcommitted by over $6 trillion. And we have offshored assets. The corporations that have been moving money by the bucketfuls out of the country, those companies have their money safely in the hands of the British Isles, from whom we declared independence in 1776. And you know what? We saw this coming. We actually did see it coming. What we didn't have is we didn't have a public sector. We didn't have a president. We didn't have a Congress who was willing to trust us, trust we the people, with the truth that said we're on a collision course with a really harsh reality. And now, we actually have the reality. And the good news is that Congress didn't tell us it was coming. The White House didn't tell us it was coming. But the markets did tell us it was coming, and they told us about this a long time ago. They told us about this way, 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 way back, maybe back in, I don't know, the 1800s at the Treaty of Ghent. They told us about this when they formed the Federal Reserve in 1913. They told us about this in 1933 when they set up the Social Security Administration. They told us about this in 1971 and 1972 when they decided to change how our money works. They told us about this in 1974 when they said don't trust pensions. They told us, and we didn't listen. So now we have a chance to do it a different way. We're going to start, we the people, forming a more perfect union. And we're going to take the best of what we know, we're going to take the experience of what we've had, and we're going to take the reality of this moment and transform it through an evolutionary process which will once again make humans great. Now, if that's the case, where did it go wrong? And is it something that's beyond the reach of going right? Is it possible that we can actually reclaim that beautiful mountaintop in Monticello, probably somewhere in March or April, when the dogwoods are blooming and when the azaleas are coming out and the rhododendrons are screaming through the forest with beautiful pinks and purples and whites? Is it possible that we hold these truths, that beauty, that nature, all of the wild that was surrounding that space, is it possible that that version of us still can show up? Or have we gone too far? Well, if we look at the financial markets, we actually can see that something's gone too far. We've made a bunch of promises that we can't keep. It's really hard to talk about truth without integrity. And if we have truth but we don't have integrity, what do we have in the final analysis? When we said we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, and we say that in 1776, isn't there another voice in 1776 that's actually saying something entirely different? Isn't there in The Wealth of Nations Adam Smith's mandate that says that laborers are required to create value, and that there is a new class replacing the monarchy, replacing the ecclesiastical structures? Isn't there a new class called the industrialist, called the financier? Isn't there a new class that's coming in? And are they using this cunning tool called the corporation, which rather than holding people accountable is expressly set up to limit liability so that the human isn't responsible for his or her action? Because this anonymized other, this ephemeral construction called a corporation, is set up expressly for the purpose of enrichment of that individual who has no accountability. Is it possible that 1776, that Declaration of Independence, that freedom from tyranny, freedom from monarchies, freedom from taxation, freedom from troops that come in and actually occupy your homes, is that freedom actually emerging exactly at the same time that a new form of indenture is being born? Did we cast off King George only to take on King Morgan? See, when we think about it that way, when we see the world that is emerging in 1776, we learn some very important things, because truth wasn't truth. And the truth that came out of the pen of Jefferson actually wasn't entirely true either. We held truth to be self-evident, but we held truth to be self-evident for those like us. Because in the formation of America, those who came, the destitute who came, freeing from debtor's prison, the religious persecution that drove people into enclaves in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and other places. In fact, my own ancestors, David Martin, the first ancestor to come across, who left while his father was still imprisoned for his faith in Europe. Is it the case that that freedom impulse actually brought us into a land where we didn't consider what it meant to be we the people? We actually considered ourselves to be the individual that needs to survive, the individual that needs to flourish, the individual that needs to connect and be supported, but not we the people, not a consensus of a better us. So what we have in 1776 is a very interesting convergence of a very clear expression of freedom from. But we actually didn't define very well what we were free to. And so here's the tiny little problem. The tiny little problem is something that we can understand if we think about a doctor and a hammer in our knee. When a doctor hits our knee and flexes our knee, we actually call that a reflex. And the reflex is actually something that happens at the spinal cord. It doesn't involve the brain. It happens at the spinal cord. And what it does is it says there's a stimulus, and I'm going to create a response. But the problem with the reflex is it's not considered. I don't sit there and ponder, oh, there's a hammer. It's coming towards my knee. What would I do? I merely know that there's a stimulus, and my muscles and my nerves conspire to have a response. But the problem with that is that it is not governed by thought. It's not governed by consciousness. It's actually governed by merely an avoidance of an aversive stimulus. Freedom is a reflex. It takes something intolerable, something suboptimal, something that's not the best of us. And what we do is we say, definitely not that. So we reject it. We throw it off. We cast it aside. We use language, as we did in the Declaration of Independence, of separation. But the problem with a reflex is there's another half of a reflex. There's this other thing. And there's a whole bunch of compensatory frameworks inside the human body that says, while my knee is jumping on one side, the rest of my body is responding. There's an entire stabilization action that's taking place exactly the same time as the reflex is happening. And if we don't think about what that is, we can reject one form of tyranny. We can reject the monarchy. We can reject something that we find impalatable. But the flip side is that there is something else that's actually becoming stronger. Something else that's actually taking in that energy, which says the reflex is happening over here, there's a stabilization impulse happening somewhere else. The Declaration of Independence was the reflex. The wealth of nations, Adam Smith, the birth of the corporation, the hegemony of the corporation was the stabilizing impulse. Because now that we don't have to serve the master as a monarch, we now get to serve a new, more diffuse, more anonymous, more remote master called the financier. called the corporation, called the employer, called the industrialist. And see, what happened was the birth of America, co-emergent with 1776, the birth of the corporation, allowed the first seed that fell into the fertile ground of America not to be liberty and the pursuit of happiness. The first seed that fell into the ground was, this is the first time we could do the experiment of a nation built on a corporation. When you say it that way, it's somewhat chilling. Because we now, in February 2017, want to talk about the role of influence and how much money got spent to get people into office, and how much governments are controlled by special interests and they're controlled by finance. But we, the people, created an experiment where we, the people, in the rejection of monarchies and tyranny, actually created the system. Each one of us, each farmer that sold cotton, each farmer that sold tobacco, each industrialist that encouraged the formation of the iron industry and the coal industry and the rail industry and the electricity industry, each one of us actually watered and fertilized and cared for the experiment that was not about the best of humanity. It was about this other thing, this other story. And that story was fueled by something else that happened at the birth of America. See, at the birth of America, Thomas Jefferson talked about religious freedom being a very important reality, and that was an accommodation because Jefferson wasn't that concerned about religion for himself. He actually didn't wake up every day kind of really wondering what was going on and what hymns were going to be sung on Sunday. He was actually on the other side of the fence, only capable of speaking about religion to make sure that he accommodated those who needed him to have the right lingo and the right jargon. He needed to appeal to an audience that actually had a very clear sense of the preeminence of religion. And Jefferson, in his Statute of Religious Freedom, once again triggered a reflex that said we're not going to have a papacy, we're not going to have an ecclesiastical government, we're going to have a world in which we're going to have tons of tolerance for religion. But inside of the religion of that day, we had lost the intermediary. We had lost the papacy. We had lost that notion that somewhere there's a bishop, or there is an archbishop, or there is somebody who takes care of us. And now all of a sudden, our not only lives, but our mortality are our responsibility. And we talk about the Protestant work ethic as a way that fueled the engine of the economy, but we don't talk about the fact that the Protestant work ethic had inside of it also a fear of death and a notion that heaven, an aspirational some other, some better, something else out there that's better than what we have here, is the motivation for our behavior. And while we were taught that somehow or another we were supposed to live in this world so that we could actually one day get the rewards of the world beyond, the same industrialist that was there to accommodate the replacement of the monarchy and the replacement of the ecclesiastical orders, that same industrialist knew that if they could just find the right balance, Adam Smith talked about this as the polarization between the rent extractor and the rent provider, his interesting definition of labor. If we could just hit the right balance, we could give people enough to sate their core expectations, their core needs, and their core desires, but we wouldn't give them too much. We wouldn't make it too good for them. We wouldn't have too much pursuit of happiness because they're being told on Sunday they don't need to pursue happiness because one day happiness is going to come on a cloud with a harp, with wings. So the present was not what we made the best of because we knew that the future was going to be better. But what if the present is what we have? What if we, the people? What if life? What if liberty? What if the pursuit of happiness? What if these things are meant to be today? Well, we didn't hold that to be true. And every system that we had at the inception of the country reminded us daily that there was an elusive other. There was a somewhere else There was a better something somewhere to aspire to. And that was the founding of the Great Experiment. Into that experiment, we see a number of things inserted right at the beginning that start to take us off of that Jeffersonian ideal, that beautiful statement of possibility. We see that the industrial input into America came at the expense of a famine in Europe, where we had migrants coming from Europe, and they could work in sweatshop conditions in the Northeast, and they could work in insufferable and intolerable industries that no one would want to work in, their own hell on earth. They could stoke the furnaces, which ultimately drove the steam engines, which ultimately drove the wheels of industry into motion. And those immigrants who left famine were able to get enough to eat by, but they did not get an American dream. They traded one nightmare for another. We know that there were First Nations all across the country who were inconveniently in the way of accessing resources. And so rather than finding ways to embrace and accommodate their wisdom of how to manage and steward the land, our impulse was to say, you know what, we need the railroad to go through your land, and we need to actually make sure that we can feed the workers on that railroad, so we're going to shoot your buffalo, and we're going to do all of those things to take from you, not to include you. We, the people, didn't mean people who didn't look like they were European. We, the people, meant some other something. And by the way, if we look at the period of time from the mid-1700s all the way up to the mid-1800s, the first 100 years pre the Revolution all the way up until the Civil War, that we, the people, did not include the people who were chained on ships and brought over from Africa. The engine of growth, the engine of economic success, the engine that put in motion all of the great American productivity that was chained to boats and then brought to an America that was not a land of the free and the home of the brave. In fact, it was a land of shackles. And it was a land of being beaten, and it was a land of having your life extracted from you. We did not believe in life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. We believed in life for those who had the approval of the consensus. We believed in liberty for those of the establishment who actually had the right to dictate dominion over. We had the pursuit of happiness, but the pursuit of happiness only for those who actually were authorized to be happy. And it was the trail of tears that marked the first 40 years of the 1800s. It was the trail of tears at auction houses where slave families were separated. That's the engine that built the great American experiment that said, we the people, these truths, self-evident, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That's what drove us into our current condition. And then, for those of us who actually were supposed to be the beneficiaries of life and the pursuit of happiness, that wonderful Protestant echo of the you're going to die and there's a better beyond led us into a very insidious innovation that was also part of the American tradition. It was, in fact, an actuary who came up with the idea that you could measure the likelihood of living, and you can compare lives to each other, and you could bet the difference between how one person was going to live and ultimately die and how another person was going to live and die. And it was America that actually served as the fertile birthplace for an innovation that actually only started in the 1780s, right about the time that the country started, and that was the innovation of life insurance. Now, if you think about it, it's a very interesting thing to put in the backdrop of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that we're going to create an economic model based on death. We're going to build an economic engine that becomes so important that by 1780, $2 billion, $2 billion in 1780, more money than the collective value of most other industries, agriculture, iron, rail, $2 billion were the bets against life. And that was in 1880, we the people saying we were going to energize more about death than we were about life. in 100 years, from the birth of actuarial sciences to the tyranny of an insurance system that said, now we don't have a monarch to care for us. Now we don't have a god or a pope to care for us. Now we have to care for ourselves. What we did was we placed our faith and confidence not in life, not in liberty, not in the pursuit of happiness, but we placed our confidence in a corporate financial model that said that something about today is not adequate to ensure my future, so I'm going to pay today. I'm going to indenture myself today for a future that I'm not even going to experience. That is a future that is going to be for the someone else somewhere else. And who is the beneficiary of that policy? Oh, sure, the Scottish Presbyterians wanted it to be widows and orphans. That's who was supposed to be the beneficiary. But if you look at who the real beneficiary was, the real beneficiary was banking systems that actually wanted to make sure that your debt could be paid for your overconsumption in life. It sounds so good to say, don't you care about your children after you die? Wouldn't you love to make sure they're okay? Don't you care about the wife that you leave behind, Mr. Laborer? Don't you care about their family? Don't you care about what their experience is going to be? But that was the marketing propaganda. The substantive reality was that the reason why we, the people, decided to make life insurance a core industry in America was because we were being taught to consume beyond our means. And we knew that in life we'd overconsume, and therefore we would run up debt. And since we'd run up debt, we'd have to be able to pay it off. We really did this because we, the people, did not believe in life, did not believe in liberty, and did not believe in the pursuit of happiness. We actually turned something around entirely on its head. It was about not our life, our fear of death. It wasn't about liberty. It was our freedom from tyranny. It wasn't about pursuit of happiness. It was about pursuing things, artifacts, property, land, gadgets, things that would make us independent. We weren't pursuing happiness. We were pursuing our ability to protect ourselves from the outside world, from each other, from the things that actually could influence our lives. And we bet on the side of death, not on the side of life. And for 100 years, we went through a process of expanding the country through war. We went through a process of making sure our ports were open for trade through war. We built industries so that they could very rapidly pivot from an industrial frame to build out tractors and steam engines and locomotives, the ability to pivot rapidly into supplying military equipment. And so every time we'd get into another conflict, we'd have this upsurge of economic activity, and that upsurge of economic activity needed to be financed somehow. And so through this process of constantly being in conflict and then constantly running up a national debt, which then constantly needed to be paid for over a period of time, we built another model. And the other model was actually something that was never in Jefferson's mind. In fact, Jefferson was a critic of the fact that European monarchs had built systems where they would go to war, they'd run up large debts, private enterprise would come in and bail out that particular monarch, and as a result, become the, in fact, de facto rulers of the country, because the private sector would actually now have a king or a monarch beholden to them. Jefferson was railing against that, and 100 years later, that's exactly what we had in the United States. After the panics that took place in the late 1800s, what we created was a world in which banks needed to bail out governments. And when banks bail out governments, guess who starts to run the government? The banks. And this was so egregious, that by 1904, 1905, and 1906, even Congress, and let's think about the Congress, the Millionaires' Congress. This was not we the people. This was not agrarian. This was we the people Congress. That Congress, made out of nothing but aristocracy. This Congress was so offended by the influence of business and the influence of banks and the influence of insurance companies that it actually set up a commission to investigate what went wrong with America. And in 1906, and then again in 1912 and 1913, we the people actually made an inquiry into this American experiment, and we the people concluded that the experiment had been hijacked. We had the Anderson Commission, we had the Peugeot Commission, and they showed that the interlocking directorates, the same people who actually controlled the banks and controlled the insurance companies and controlled the industrial output, the same people who were all at the helm of all of the major industries were in fact the ones that were controlling the America that was once the land of the free, the land of opportunity, the land of we the people, the land of the great human experiment. And guess what? Nothing was done. We had the information, it was publicized, it was in the media, and we the people sat and said, that's too big for us to deal with. And so, interrupted by the First World War, interrupted by the mass expansion of credit and debt throughout the 1920s, which led to the Great Depression, we the people decided that it was too big for us to solve the problems that we were seeing. So we the people decided in the 1930s to turn to the very same government that we had found in the 1910s to be owned and operated and manipulated by corporations. That government, the government that we said was no longer representational, the government we said was no longer we the people, that government we turned to solve the problem of not feeling like we could do something. So what did we do? Well, we did some brilliant things, taking advantage of this amazing innovation that came out of 1913, the Federal Reserve, which is when we the people decided to let a group of private banks and insurance companies actually control all of our money, which was a decision we the people actually let happen. That decision, against the backdrop of that, we decided to introduce other really great innovations. And in 1933, to solve the problem of financial manipulations, we the people decided to create, are you ready for this? An insurance company to insure banks in the form of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, an insurance company for banking. We came up with the merger, the unholy alliance of the very things that merely 20 years earlier we had decided were being hijacked by the mercantile impulse. And we did nothing. We didn't say, well, hold on a minute. Maybe there's a fundamental problem here. Maybe turning to banking and insurance, maybe turning to that impulse is actually a bad idea when what we're trying to solve is a banking and insurance problem. It's probably a really bad idea to actually form an insurance company to make sure we protect the banks if what we're worried about is people not being protected from insurance companies and the banks. So what we do is we create a national scheme of banking and insurance. And then we do something else. As part of the New Deal, we create another thing, which is we don't trust corporations anymore, so what we're going to do is trust a government controlled by corporations to come up with something that controls our future. And so we create this thing called the Social Security Administration, which is to care for us. And what's going to happen is we're going to tax ourselves in the present so that we can take care of a future that's indeterminate. Man, that sounds a lot like life insurance, doesn't it? And we built a pension system that mirrored the life insurance system. And not surprisingly, what we did was we said, we the people are going to write checks, and we're going to send those checks to someplace. We don't actually know where it goes, but it goes into a trust fund. And we use the word trust very cunningly, because obviously, who wouldn't have confidence? If it's actually trust, and if it's a guarantee corporation, trust, guarantee, that sounds great. Of course I want to do that. But we never asked, where was the money going? What was it actually doing? And we didn't ask that because the answer in 1934, 1935, and 1936 would have been as odious as the answers when it was asked again in the 1970s, and that is, We were writing checks to an illiquid government agency that was buying, are you ready for this? United States debt. Now, why was it so important that we had debt? Well, it turns out that debt is a funny little animal. Debt actually lives uncorrelated to any other factors. Where markets rise and fall, where the fortunes of things can come up and down over a period of time, debt is a very fixed product, and it actually behaves in a very similar fashion over time. The Federal Reserve was set up so that it could stabilize the origination of debt, so that the private sector investor could actually harvest value from the taxpayer public. It's not surprising, by the way, that the 16th Amendment that allows us to tax the public at a federal level co-occurs with the establishment of a Federal Reserve that says our currency is going to be based on debt. Well, the faith and confidence in those two things are very clear. As long as you're paying taxes, we have confidence that we're going to take your money. That system works. Debt expands, and the monetary system continues to expand around that. And the pensions, the Social Security pensions, the corporate pensions, all the way up until the 1970s, those pensions were all doing what? They were actually feeding money back into the indebtedness of the country. Where does it sound like land of the free, home of the brave? Where is it that when we look at the actual Declaration of Independence, we look at the fact that one of the things that the First and the Second Continental Congress told us was intolerable was a system in which we, the people, were taxed in a way in which we were not represented. That was the core of what we said we were actually creating an experiment away from. And by 1933 and 1934, we built a system that was 100% driven by the very thing we said we rejected. See, this is the American experiment having been fully hijacked. And now we move forward and we realize that as things move along, these things, these debt instruments, all of these models that we build start to come due. You make a promise, you have to keep it. We hold these truths. What if we make promises that we don't intend to keep? What if we make promises knowing that we had no intention of keeping them? What if when Roosevelt said, we've got this new deal, we're going to create a system in which no laborer is ever going to be out on their ear after they lose their job or after they're injured or after something goes wrong and there's a catastrophic event in their family. What if that Roosevelt knew that the system he was building was built on an empty promise? That maybe one day we, the people, would forget the promises that were made? What if that was part of the architecture? And the tragedy is, that's not a what if. We had created a system where the debt that we issued in 1913 actually came due about the time that something else happened. 30 years, let's see, 30 years, 1913, 1943. Where does that put us? That puts us into a world at war. We had no intention of repaying that debt. We had every intention of distributing the refinancing of that debt to someone else. So we call a meeting at Bretton Woods. We bring together the leaders of the then Allied world and we say, if we win the war, if we have the ability to succeed here, why don't we take we the people's money and why don't we make sure it becomes the ubiquitous trading currency of the world? And everybody in the world says, well, the British pound is gone, the Deutsche Mark is gone, all of the things that we used to think of as trading currencies are gone. So if we win, if we the Allies win, we will in fact create a monetary system around the world where the American debt-denominated currency becomes the standard of trade, the standard of commerce. That world was a contingency, but it was a contingency to offset the fact that we, the people, knew we couldn't pay our debts in 1943. And so what we did was we created this whole instrument called war bonds, and we created all kinds of other ways to mask the refinancing of the first round of debt that we had no intention of paying off. And then, 1943 to 1973, the next 30-year cycle, what happens there? Well, obviously, during that period of time, America has an industrial infrastructure that's growing. We have the automotive industry that's going all over the world. We have the electric and telecommunications industries that are going all over the world. We have the radio industry. We have the TV industry. We have all sorts of things happening. We have all of this growth, and the influence of America is spreading all over the world. And we also have that wonderful thing about the agency of warfare, which is a phenomenal economic engine, and it's growing and it's spreading, and all of these things are happening. And somewhere along the line, some folks in Europe start going, I'm not sure that this thing's working out so well. We're seeing things in America that look like this debt-based system isn't working. And so in 1971, that world gets together and says, we don't have full faith and confidence in this thing called the American dollar. We don't have full faith and confidence in this thing called the U.S. economy. We don't have full faith and confidence in what we see happening in this great American economic experiment. And the legacy of 1849, the legacy of 1898, the legacy of 1913, the legacy of the Morgan $20 gold note, the legacy of gold in America, that beautiful standard that says we the people are going to have gold as the full faith and confidence backstop for all the debt and all the promises we made, we the people decided on a weekend to tell the world, don't have faith and confidence in our gold. Don't have faith and confidence in our dollar. Have faith and confidence in the illusion of our perpetual growth. And in a weekend, we erased the gold standard. And we could do it. We could do it. Because by the time we were prepared to do that, the world was addicted to our dollar in oil trade. The world was addicted to our dollar in arms trade. The world was addicted to our dollar in automotive trade and industrial trade. And it was so addicted that it couldn't find a way out. And it's not by accident that we go off of the gold standard, which linked us to European economies. And in 1972 and 1973, the Nixon administration decided to do what? Open our debt-buying freedoms to Asia. People talk about ping-pong diplomacy, where Nixon opened up China, and they talk about it as though there's some sort of ephemeral beauty and largesse on the part of America. But what we don't talk about was the fact that we needed new buyers for our debt, because Europe had said we don't believe in the future of the economy of the Americas, and we needed somebody to buy our debt. And it turns out that what really happened when Nixon went off the gold standard was he opened up the purchasing of our debt and liberalized the amount of purchasing of debt that could be done by a foreign interest. He opened it up necessarily to get China involved in the purchasing of our debt because we needed a new buyer. We, the people, had run out of credit. So we had to turn to someone else. Because we didn't turn it inwards, we actually went outwards. And we, the people, decided to start a bill of debt that is now, today, as we all talk to each other, that bill is now $18 trillion. $18 trillion. Now, $18 trillion sounds like a big number for most of us. Most of us don't have that in our checking accounts. Most of us can't really think about what a trillion anything looks like. But $18 trillion sounds like a pretty big number. And today, in February 2017, we're actually sitting there going, well, hold on a minute. Thank God we have somebody who knows how to run businesses that's now running our country, right? That's what we're all thinking. That's what we hope we're thinking. But here's the tiny little problem. 18 trillion isn't the number. Because yes, that's the debt that we have. But there's another problem. That promise that we made, that promise that said we were going to take care of our elderly, that promise that said we were going to take care of our pensions, that promise that said we the people were going to actually make sure land of the free, home of the brave meant pursuit of happiness long into after employment, that wonderful world of the retirement phase of our lives. That world that now is the reality for 60 million people, that world is a world that was filled with promises that were made by the New Deal, by Roosevelt. But here's the problem. The problem is that world runs out of money. And by running out of money, I mean goes to zero. Goes to zero by 2037. But before 2037, In fact, if it's going to make it to 2037 and run to zero, this year, right now, as you're watching this movie, this moment in time is the moment in time where, to get to that world where we run out of the promise in 2037, we have to start diminishing now, right now. We, the people, have to now say that promise we made, we're not going to keep. And let's talk about the implications of that for a moment. That means that 60 million Americans right now are going to, within the matter of weeks, effectively lose the ability to spend about 20% of the money they thought they were entitled to. 20%. Wiped out. Why? Well, we thought it was going to be 12%. In fact, the official numbers said it would be 12.7%. We'd have to reduce benefits by 12.7% sometime around 2016 or 2017. We thought it was going to be 12%. But that's before the Federal Reserve decided to reduce interest rates so that banks and insurance companies could be stabilized in 2008. The funny thing is, we the people let that happen. We the people sat and did nothing while trillions of dollars were pumped away from the future of the promise of America and pumped into these beautiful institutions that we all have come to know and love as the insurance and banking systems of the United States and of Europe and of China. We did it. And no one told us that when interest rates went down and we saw the stock markets go up, so we were told we were in this great recovery, no one told us that that recovery came with a price tag. No one told us that one day that price tag would come due. No one told us that when we actually saw interest rates going to near zero, what that meant was the income that the debt was supposed to generate was not going to flow anymore, and that income means that the Social Security programs and the pension programs and all of the benefit programs and all of the actuarial models that were built on an assumption that we would have roughly 3% or 2.5% returns on all of that government-guaranteed risk-free money, that assumption was set aside so that we could bail out financial institutions in 2008, so that we could prop up equity markets in 2010, so that we could create the illusion of a recovery by 2012. And now, here we are. We're sitting in February 2017 with a world that's insolvent. Our world's insolvent. And the very debtor's prison of Europe that most of our first immigrants came from is in fact the exact same thing that we've now created for all of us. We now live in a debtor's prison. $18 trillion of national debt. $6.5 trillion of unfunded liabilities for the deposits of our money in the banks, where the FDIC does not have enough money to actually control a run on the banks. So if there is a run on the banks run out of money. Oh, but don't mind that 6-point-something trillion dollar shortfall, because the FDIC reassures the public that it can go to the Treasury and borrow $500 billion to cover a $6 trillion liability. The math doesn't work. But don't worry, it's not just the banking system, it's not just the national debt. It's also this beautiful reality that says that we have this massive thing called Social Security, where we've made $17 trillion of promises that we're not going to keep. We've actually indebted ourselves, we've actually promised a future, and we've actually insured the present with an illiquid structure that now costs us more than the total asset value of America. Today, we're bankrupt. Not kind of bankrupt, actually bankrupt. Our liabilities exceed our assets. But that's fine, because we can solve this problem, right? We can go to the big corporations, these wonderful behemoths, these companies that actually were built as part of this phenomenal American experiment, this great limitation of liability, this great entrepreneurial impulse, this great America that said, we the people will actually take an Adam Smith model, we'll put it in the fertile soil of America, and we'll make a corporate success out of all this. That we the people, that enthusiastic promise of a future, we can clearly go to the corporations. Those corporations that now are, in fact, the patrons of the world that we actually have created, we can go to them and probably, I don't know, ask them to maybe help make something work, because somewhere along the line, that ought to work. Except for one thing, the corporations. The very beneficiaries of the system we created. Those corporations decided to offshore their assets years ago. I wonder if they actually saw something coming. I wonder if they saw on a horizon a world where this illiquidity that we're in now maybe would go after their assets, and I wonder what they did. I wonder where Apple parked its money. I wonder where GE parked its money. I wonder where IBM parked its money. I wonder where any of these companies parked their money. And why is it that suddenly we the people, that great American experiment, that great Adam Smith thing that said we're going to have this great world in which finance and corporations are going to replace monarchies and tyranny, I wonder why it is that most of those assets are now back in Ireland and in British domiciled properties. Did we, the people, actually get freedom from anything? Or was this giant 230-year experiment not an experiment about humanity? Was this giant experiment a way to hijack several 100 million people's lives and the wealth of a nation, and actually make sure that all of those resources actually don't stay at home, but in fact are now once again safely in the hands of the Isles, from which we allegedly declared independence? You know, the funny thing is, Congress, right now, is debating whether there should be an amnesty that allows corporations to bring back assets that haven't been taxed. And apparently that's too politically volatile a topic for you, the American. You couldn't tolerate it if Apple had to pay tax. You couldn't tolerate it if IBM had to pay tax. You couldn't tolerate it if GE had to pay tax, because it wouldn't be in your interest. Except for the fact that because those assets are now overseas, they are now kept from being able to be part of the solution set that says that in February of 2017, we the people are going to now start breaking promises to we the people. And we've got no place to turn. Because the money that actually was created by this great experiment, the actual wealth that was created by the experiment, is no longer within the shores of America. That wealth is gone. And since that wealth is gone, the ability to retrieve it is also gone. We, the people, have to solve that problem. Now, by now, you've choked on your last bit of popcorn, you've slurped down your last little bit of Coke, and you're sitting there going, we, the people, have been had. And there's probably a bad guy somewhere out there that did all of this. And the answer is, we did it to ourselves. We did it. We believed in a world where there was always something better beyond. We believed in a world where somehow or another our fear of death needed to change how we lived. We believed in a world where we had to look to ourselves rather than look to our neighbors and to our network to support us. We believed in a world where we wanted to surrogate our responsibility, because even though we got rid of a monarch and we got rid of a pope and we got rid of an archbishop, we got rid of all of those things, we still believed that there was someone somewhere else out there that was responsible for our lives. And the wake-up call that we have right now is to be accountable. There isn't a somewhere out there. There's now. There is this moment right now. We, the people, have a failed experiment. We were part of that experiment, which means we actually were part of the failure. The great news about an experiment is it's just that. It's just an experiment. You learn the bits that work, you learn the bits that don't work. And we can do something with it. The great thing about where we are now is we, the people, have a chance to do something for the first time. And that is to go back to a hilltop in Monticello and read that document. Read that We, the people, and we hold these truths. And when we say that all men are created equal, we don't put an asterisk next to that and say, except for the slaves, except for the Indians, except for the people who don't look like us, except for the cheap laborers from India and China, except for. If we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then all of us are. And we're all in this together. And there is no version of skin color or ethnicity or anything else that can stand in the way of us working together. So we, the people, can stand together. If we, the people, believe that this is about endowed by inalienable rights, then we have to see a world in which tolerance, that principle that says that your liberty, in fact, does not impinge on my liberty and mine does not impinge on yours, so we better figure out how each other can live together. So liberty is actually something that is in fact part of how we treat each other, that tolerance is how we engage with each other, that we don't pick the populations that we don't like, that we don't close our borders to people who aren't like us because we fear them. We actually have to understand what they have to offer. We have to understand who they are and what makes them tick, and figure out what bits of them, not just their kebabs, not just their tacos, not just whatever it's the bits that we can actually eat in our own homes, but what is it the bits about those people that actually can contribute to us, and what is it about us that can contribute to them? Liberty and the pursuit of happiness is actually not the pursuit of things. See, the industrial model told us that the pursuit of happiness was how much stuff we had. A car in every garage, a chicken in every pot. The New Deal that said stuff was the arbiter of success and happiness. Success and happiness is not the stuff. Look at the person sitting next to you right now. Look at him. Happiness is the fact that you can sit in peace next to them. Hold the hand of the person who you came to see this movie with right now. Reach out and hold their hand. Feel them. Feel their vitality. Feel the fact that you live in a place and you're experiencing a moment right now, in this present moment right now, where you can actually touch another human being, and that human being is not a virtual hologram that is delivered by some corporate experience in augmented reality. That's a person who actually has blood pumping through their arteries and their veins. That's a person who's breathing and animated and living, and they walked in the theater with you, and with any luck, they're going to walk out with you. That's the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness that says we actually are engaged. And with that engagement, examine what you're doing right now. Are you waiting to live until you retire? The great news is, give it up. The wonderful thing about this promise being broken is it was a shitty promise in the first place. You didn't need someone else to take care of your life after you were done working for someone else. You actually needed to take care of your life now. And if you took care of your life now, if you pursued happiness now, if you engaged in liberty now, if you were part of a community now, you wouldn't need to worry about the what happens in the future, because it turns out that that community would embrace and love you. Live. Be at liberty. Pursue happiness. And we, the people, can thereby form a more perfect union.